Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I have not done a recording in a little while, but I have read a couple of good books recently, and I thought I would talk to you a little bit about one of them, which is The Years of Rice and Salt by Kim Stanley Robinson. And I have read now a handful of Kim Stanley Robinson books. I guess three, if you count that as a handful. Maybe five as a handful because of number of fingers. But three Kim Stanley Robinson books. I read Ice Hinge a number of years ago, and I loved it. And I read Shaman more recently, and I loved it. And then this one, and I loved it. So I guess I'm going to have to stop using his Mars trilogy as my punchline for hard sci-fi jokes, because I keep enjoying the books of Kim Stanley Robinson that I read. This one is really fascinating. It is alternate history on a huge scale over the course of the total book, even if in each kind of individual story is fairly self contained. Um, and we are presented with a world where things have gone fairly differently, because somehow the bacteria that causes the Black Death, the bubonic plague, mutates and becomes significantly more deadly, or perhaps significantly more deadly in a second wave. It's kind of unclear exactly how it happens because everybody dies, in Western Europe, basically. In most of, I guess not even just Western Europe, basically all of Europe gets almost totally wiped out. There's a few kind of small enclaves, and bits, small groups of people who end up surviving. So like there's, it turns out, a like small community in the Orkney Islands that have survived and continued to live and all that sort of stuff, but only in these kind of very, very isolated places where the plague didn't reach, and almost everybody else has been killed off. Of course, the people living in this world don't understand that as anything kind of different, right? They're not seeing our world, and so they aren't thinking about like what life would have been like differently if all of that happened. And so we end up with a world where a number of kind of major historical events happen very differently. So, for instance, one of the kind of sequences in this book is about the Chinese discovery of the Americas. Of course, they don't call it the Americas because America is named for Amerigo Vespucci, who had never been born in this world. So they call it Yingzhou. But the discovery of the New World is a big deal, and the Chinese build up this huge war fleet to try to take over Japan, and end up being caught in a storm and being pulled into the kind of immense clockwise Pacific current around the edge of the Pacific Ocean, and eventually land on land. And they're like, what? Where is this? Is this the fabled Western land that the first emperor was searching for, and all that sort of stuff? It turns out there are some people already there, and we get essentially the kind of first contact between the people of the old world and the Americas in a different way. And all throughout the story, there's these kind of really interesting, some of them sort of versions of real history events, and some of them kind of their own thing. Um, Although I think if you know sort of a kind of, even me, not a professional historian or anything like that, can recognize a number of the sequences. So like there's one sort of self-contained sequence that has to do with the alchemist in Samarkand, and it is basically like the Newtonian discoveries. It is the development of essentially Newtonian physics. They start, using prisms to separate light and come up with a theory of gravity. And it's this kind of incredible scientific revolution happening in a different part of the world, but people discovering the same concepts and using different kind of terms and different ideas to connect with those concepts, also because they have a totally different cultural background. So that becomes really, really interesting, really fascinating. One of the best parts of the book there. And then there's some really kind of fun and interesting bits. Like for instance, in their culture, because Western Europe got wiped out, their analogs for history are sort of comparing the things that would have happened in Europe to things that happened in other parts of the world, in Asia and in North Africa, in particular. And so, for instance, there's late in the book, there's a historian who is proposing a theory that what we know of as England would have been fairly similar to what happened with the island of Japan, and that after an English king was able to unify the island, that it would have been similar to the kind of post Tokugawa Japan, and because that's their cultural uh familiarity, right? They don't know any of the kind of real history that we know, but they know their own history that is different and fascinating. And all of that has sort of sidestepped one of the kind of core elements of the book, which is this idea that the characters are the same souls. There's the jati, the tribe, that is going through cyclical life and death and rebirth together. This group of characters, and they all each given character shares the same first letter of their name across incarnations, so you can kind of tell who is who. And they all have kind of different different characters, different ways of seeing the world, and so much of this story is about essentially kind of people with different ways of seeing the world in competition, different expectations of how things ought to be between these different characters and across these kind of immense timescapes. Is this idea of over the course of centuries and centuries, how these different people kind of think that the world ought to be, what would make the world a better place. And so you have a B character and a K character and an I character, and an F character and an S character and a couple of other. Those are the B and the K and the I are, I think, the kind of central three for most of these stories. And so in the very first story, the B character is a timid renegade who ends up in trouble, and the K character is a young man, a man who is enslaved on the coast of East Africa, and they end up working together and doing stuff together. And then in the Alchemist story, the I character is a friend, and the K character is the alchemist himself, and the B character is his son-in-law. And so they're all kind of working together. And then there's another, very, very kind of late in the book, there's a story that is sort of an equivalent of a world war. And the B character and the K character and the I character are all Chinese soldiers fighting against the kind of immense pan-Islamic armies in Central Asia. And it's fascinating, this conceit, this idea of these characters as essentially kind of inconsistent experiences, but sort of a consistent being, in the idea that they are, there's something about their character that is maintained through these cycles of life and death and rebirth. And every time they get to the bardo, there's a sense that perhaps they're getting closer to something, and then eventually that sort of becomes not just what the story is about in terms of kind of the meta plot across all these episodes, but sort of towards the end, as the story becomes in some ways more and more reflexive, and the characters are thinking about history and trying to kind of transform these different ideas about the way the world ought to be into a sense of history and what things ought to be like, and how we should kind of live our lives and establish our governments and interact with the people around us, and what matters on the grand scale, and all these different things comes to be about that too. And there's one of the essentially the very last story is the very last sequence is just so good because it brings all of this together, and it becomes about this old man looking back at his life, and he's talking about these different ideas of history and tragic history and comic history and Dharma history, where the world kind of is not perfect, but because we are doing the best we can, it gets better over time. And this idea that history only kind of really begins once we have made right some almost not original sin is not the right term, but these very kind of basic issues and inequalities that have been with us throughout, from kind of the beginning of history, and that real history is only after we have decided to make the world better by attempting to do something about these inequalities and tyrannies and all of the kind of terrible things that we are familiar with from history in general. And it's so good. It's just such a perfect conclusion to this really immense story about what life ought to be like, what all these people think that the world ought to be like, and how to live in a better way. And it's so cool, and it's really interesting as a an alternate history that I think takes very seriously this idea of kind of both there being sort of deep cultural differences and really kind of major things that have happened differently, and also take seriously this idea that people are still people, and they are intelligent and committed to all of these different things that are important to them, and that ultimately this is a kind of really adept balancing act of these different concepts in order to create this world that is at once kind of hugely different in all the details, and yet kind of recognizable in some of these real kind of broad strokes, and these sort of expectations of the people who live in it. And it makes for a really great book. So yeah, Years of Rice and Salt. It's really good. It's pretty long. I think it comes out to, like 700 pages or something. But totally worth it. And you could probably, in my case, I didn't totally do this, but you could read each kind of individual section as a short story, kind of over a much longer period of time, and I think totally feel fulfilled, right? Each of these kind of historical sequences that is largely self-contained could totally be read one at a time instead of as kind of one sort of continuous novel if you wanted to. Um, that would be really cool as well. So yeah, Years of Rice and Salt, Kim Stanley Robinson. Go check it out if this all sounds interesting to you, because it was really interesting to me. Leave a comment down below if you have read this one, or if it sounds interesting, or if you've read some other stuff that sounds similar and interesting, whatever uh, else like that. And otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.